You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 17th of October 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up.
Your presence today here and our first meeting in this format is absolutely historic.
As the EU meets 6 Gulf states in Brussels, we examine a significant new step for both regions and ask whether 6 years after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, if all has been forgiven. Also ahead, how much further can Ukraine push for support? As President Zelensky lays out his so-called victory plan, we'll examine Kyiv's long-term chances of help. We'll hear from our correspondent who's in Frankfurt at the world's oldest book fair, and
in terms of performance, we tried to colour it with as much authenticity as we possibly could as well.
The actor Yasmin K. Allen tells us about capturing Turkey on screen. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. An emergency meeting of the UN Security Council has heard dire warnings about the humanitarian situation in northern Gaza, where Israel is mounting a fresh ground offensive against Hamas. Seoul's former police chief has been found not guilty of negligence following the deaths of 159 people in a Halloween crush in 2022. And Sydney's beaches have been closed after hundreds of black balls, suspected to be toxic waste, have washed up on the shorelines. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, the United States has announced a new package of security assistance for Ukraine worth $425 million after a phone call between President Biden and President Zelensky. The White House has said the support for Ukraine will be the focus of Mr. Biden's European tour, which begins today. And earlier, Mr. Zelensky put forward what he called a victory plan to his own parliament for ending the war with Russia. Well, to tell us more and bring us up to date on all these, I'm joined now by Maria Avdiva, who's a security analyst based in Kyiv. A very good morning to you, Maria.
Morning, Emma. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. So tell us a little bit more about this announcement made by Joe Biden. It came quite late last night about this $425 million. This effectively sustains Ukraine's war for a little longer, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly so, because Ukraine critically depends on the help from US and also from our other partners. And I think that Joe Biden's move shows that the United States will be given everything they have, so to say, in reserves before the elections. And we have a couple of months after the elections before the new president, whoever will be elected, comes to power. So because of the financial year in the United States, they do have some reserves and they are ready to give Ukraine whatever is there. And this is a good sign because soldiers on the front line, they critically need more ammunition because Ukraine is much more outgunned compared to Russia troops.
Indeed. I mean, the United States, as you say, is keen to get as much signed off as possible before the November elections. And also what they are supplying seems to be exactly what Ukraine needs at the moment. Air-to-ground munitions, armoured vehicles, things that can sustain Kyiv and Ukraine through the winter.
Well, yes, but still a lot of needed, and sometimes soldiers don't have very essential things. And I've just met one of the units close to the front lines in Kharkiv, and they say they are crowdfunding and we're working with civil society organization to supply them with just basic need like heaters for their hands and nets and so on. And they do not receive, actually that unit does not have anything new from the States. They still use very old Soviet ammunition that Ukraine has. So this is critically needed, but Ukraine is lacking much more air defense is needed. And as you know, there is a huge push for more shells and for more missiles to use for Patriots and for other systems, Western systems Ukraine has. Like, for example, today, Ukraine was again massively attacked with drones, and Russia does this to deplete Ukrainian systems. So with daily attacks, they deplete the ammunition and missiles Ukraine has, so that this need is all the time growing.
Maria, let's talk about Volodymyr Zelensky's speech to the Ukrainian parliament yesterday. Some were expecting that he would be forced to make concessions in his vision for peace and his vision for victory over Russia. But he doubled down, didn't he, with his victory plan?
Well, the victory plan is something that President Zelensky first time presented to Ukrainian parliament, because he had this tour over European capitals where he was talking to the leaders of the states. He was in Germany, he was in France and other countries. And he said yesterday that there are several secret amendments to the plan. So something that will be just one negotiated with Britain, with the Germany, with France and others. But what was different from what he was talking and he was addressing before, he said that for the first time that the victory is something that when we will make Kremlin understand that he loses the ability to sustain the war. Because before that, he was very often referring to Ukraine getting back to the 1991 borders. Now, I think at the current stage of the war, he realizes that it's not possible to do in the nearest months or future. So he now changes his speech to this statement that we need the united effort to stop Kremlin, and that Putin realizes that he is not able to continue with the war, and he makes his troops to stop. This, I think, is the most current Ukrainian goal to achieve. And for this, Ukraine needs the support of all the other partners.
And a key part of that support, part of Zelensky's victory plan, is the invitation to join NATO. Is that correct? I mean, how likely is that to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the invitation to join NATO, as we have heard at the latest NATO summit, is how it was called a bridge. So the bridge that has to be there. But I think at least Ukraine, this will be a long-term goal. But for a short-term goal, I think the office of the president puts the guarantees for Ukraine, a very hard guarantees that will let Russia know that if after the agreement is achieved, or some kind of agreement is achieved, Russia attacks any part of Ukraine, the response will be harsh and severe. So I think this is what Ukraine is trying to get. I don't think that Zelensky thinks that the NATO membership will given right now, but this is a long-term perspective, and this is put into Ukrainian constitution as a shorter-term thing. I think that Ukraine is looking to get these security guarantees from NATO countries and from our closest allies, including Great Britain.
So this is the sticking point, though, isn't it, Maria, that getting the support from the allies is absolutely crucial, because this plan is only as good as Western allies receive it. And we saw Zelensky do a rapid tour of France, Italy, Germany and the UK last week, talking to each leader about the victory plan, trying to persuade. And one didn't get the sense that everybody engaged and bought into it immediately. He'll have a fight on his hands getting this through, won't he?
Yeah, absolutely. You're completely right, Emma. And this is crucial. I mean, without the support, Ukraine will not be able to continue the war. And this was the scene from the very start, because look at the map and look on the size of Russia and Ukraine. And Russia has enough resources to continue the war. And for that, to sustain this war, Ukraine needs to get continuous support from the partners. And I think the one of the key points that President Zelensky wants to achieve is to get this permission to use longer range weapons to hit military targets inside Russia, because currently the war is very unjust. Russia is carrying the war on Ukrainian territory every day, hitting civilian targets, killing civilians in Ukraine, whereas Ukraine does not have a permission to hit legitimate military targets inside Russia because of the, so to say, fear of escalation, which we hear from, for example, the current Biden administration. That's not fair. Like Russia started the war, Putin started the war, Ukraine has to have the ability to fight back, because otherwise it's just, Russia step by step crawling and occupying more Ukrainian territories, town after town. They level everything to the earth, and then they get more and more. And for your question, for if Ukraine will not be supported, Ukrainian soldiers alone and with the ammunition we have will not be able to stop the invasion. And then we see that Poland and the Baltic states are taking the Russian threat very seriously, because they realize, and they have seen it before, that Russia is not going to stop.
So is this a chance, talking about what you just mentioned there about Poland, for the European Union, for you and for Europe indeed, to have to step up here in the long term, given the fact that beyond November the 4th, November the 5th, we do not know what America will be able to do. So the focus now goes on to the European Union and Zelensky's ability to woo them.
Well, yes, I think this is what Ukraine is currently trying to do, to get as much European support. And I think the positive thing is that many European countries do realize that this threat is very real. And for example, if we talk about Germany, and who is reluctant to give this permission to use their Taurus missiles, but still there were many times when the Germany's Minister of Defense said that they think the war is real. They realize that Russia is not going to stop here. So this, I think, will push the partners to provide more help and to take the necessary steps to step up with Ukraine in this fight with Russia, because this is the war on European soil. It's not happening elsewhere. It's not the war in the Middle East, though all the attention is there, I know, but still this is something that is already in Europe. Russian drones have already crossed the border and have already been in the airspace of the NATO countries, in the airspace of Poland and Romania. And this is what Russia is trying, and all the time trying to cross these lines to see what will be the response. And they will continue, because Putin only realizes and understands the voice and of strength.
Maria Avdieva, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Kyiv. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. It is 10:13 a.m. in Abu Dhabi, 7:13 a.m. here in London. Now, some are saying better late than never, but the EU has held its first summit with the Gulf states. It's part of a diplomatic push by the bloc to build friendships further afield. For the 6 Arab states, there are strategic benefits too. And to tell us more about them, I'm joined now by Suniva Rose, who's Brussels correspondent for the National of Abu Dhabi. Good morning to you, Suniva.
Good morning.
So who was in the meeting and what were they talking about?
So there were lots of heads of state at the meeting. We had most EU leaders were there, except for some absentees like Olaf Scholz from Germany. but the 6 GCC countries were represented at high level, including Mohammed bin Salman, and that's a first. He's never been at an EU summit. And what were they talking about? Well, they were talking about mostly the war in the Middle East and in Lebanon and in Gaza, even though you have to understand this is a summit that's been, under preparation for years, ever since, in 2022, the EU and the GCC relaunched their strategic partnership. Their first cooperation agreement was in 1989. So some officials were thinking, this is long overdue, and it's been 35 years, really. We should have been having this summit a long time ago.
So this is the European Union and the Gulf positioning themselves in what way? In an enormous build-up of decades, as you say. But what is the strategic aim of it?
The strategic aim is really to enhance ties, on many, many topics. So first of all, for example, a big topic for the GCC is trade. The EU is their second export partner. So they really want to, they're working on a free trade agreement, and this has been under the works for years, but talks stalled in 2008. So 2 years ago, they tried to relaunch these talks, and this summit, for example, was a way of positioning themselves on that. They also want to talked about visas. And that's a big issue for GCC countries. They want a visa waiver. And for example, the UAE already has it, but Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait don't, and they would like to. So they wanted to talk about that. There's a feeling in GCC countries that they're ready, and really it's just a political decision, and it's up to EU countries and the EU Parliament to approve it. Also, EU officials were saying that it's the first time, the fact that they're just sitting all together in a room for the first time just allowed them to kind of exchange views on these matters and see how they can move forward. They're hoping to hold this summit every 2 years now. And that's a format that the EU already has with big regions, for example, Latin American regions. They have these summits every 2 years. So now this summit with the GCC countries is going to also be held every 2 years and kind of, join that tradition of high-level summits with other regions in the world and the EU.
What has been brought to the fore, at least from the European side, is the human rights issues. I mean, the picture of the Prime Minister of the Netherlands shaking the hands of Mohammed bin Salman has asked and raised an awful lot of questions, not least from within the European Union itself. It is 2018 when the Saudis approved the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul. This was the moment when Saudi Arabia found itself in an awful lot of trouble. Is there a sense that the European Union is happy to brush that aside and welcome Saudi back into the fold?
Yeah, definitely. There were concerns raised by human rights organizations, by some MEPs in Brussels as well, about MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, attending the summit. And this being, an attempt at whitewashing his reputation. But when you're at the summit as a journalist and you're talking about this with EU officials, it's as if the topic didn't really exist. It wasn't addressed, at least during the meetings, and they said that EU member states didn't feel that this was a topic that needed to be addressed. So it definitely did not take center stage at the summit itself. It wasn't discussed, and it looks like there's a real feeling, from what I understand, that there's a need to discuss topics like trade, economy, visas, and move forward. Definitely, yeah, I can't agree more.
Will there be a sense, though, that in order for the Gulf states and in particular Saudi can come to the European table, there will be concessions that will be demanded in terms of addressing human rights? Or will it simply be literally trade, business and military strategy, and we'll come to it in a minute, the issues of what's happening in Lebanon and Gaza?
Human rights still mentioned in topics like trade. For example, it's a very technical conversation, but from what I understand, one of the blocking points on the free trade agreements is that there are human rights clauses that are, in all EU free trade agreements with different areas in the world. There are human rights clauses in these agreements, and that may be one of the stumbling blocks in negotiations. So human rights appear in the discussions, but but it's not like they're specifically tied to Saudi Arabia or Mohammed bin Salman's reputation, if you understand what I mean.
Yes. Tell us a little bit more about the strategic benefits of the EU and the Gulf states coming together when it comes to solving the immediate crises that the world is facing at the moment. What's happening in Gaza? What is happening in Lebanon? What is happening in Ukraine? Is there a sense that a strategy could be formed to try and address the issues on a more multilateral level?
Yeah, they're very difficult topics for both sides to engage in. And I think there was a clear attempt, though, from the EU to bring the GCC on their side when it comes to Russia and its war against Ukraine. Commission President von der Leyen, in her opening speech, was very explicit about that and said she really hoped they could work together on it. But you could sense in the joint statement that the language was very neutral. And it was probably, and EU officials said that talks were tough. So you can definitely get the feeling that talks were tough on Russia, Ukraine, Gaza, Lebanon, and Israel, and what language exactly could be used. For example, a draft that was circulating yesterday morning had an explicit reference to Russia's war aggression in Ukraine, and that then didn't appear in the final communique, which made reference to UN language on the war, which did talk about, Russia's aggression, but only in brackets as quotes from UN resolution texts. For example, on Israel and Lebanon, there was no explicit reference on the Lebanon paragraphs to Israel or to Hezbollah, or, it was just general wording on the escalation must be avoided, though there were explicit calls for ceasefires in Lebanon and in Gaza. But if you understand it, what was not explicit was how it started, which I think is really the main point, the main difference between the EU and GCC, and who do you lay the blame on the escalation in the Middle East, with some countries in the EU who are quite close to Israel who squarely lay the blame on Hamas, whereas I think in the Arab world there's definitely a view that this is that this needs more context, that it goes back to Israeli-Palestinian issues that go back decades.
Sunniva Roos from The National, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme.
It is definitely a project that bridges that gap. It made me really happy how it was received on BBC, because 20% of it is in Turkish, the scenes. We pushed for certain scenes to be shot in Turkish, and we just felt like certain scenes just didn't make sense for it to be in English.
From the actor Yasmin K. Allen and author Barbara Nadel about the hit series The Turkish Detective. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
7:22 here in London. Let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Steve Crawshaw, author, journalist and former director of Human Rights Watch UK. A very good morning to you, Steve.
Good morning.
Now, Steve bounded into the room with a real spring in his step and enthusiasm. And I said, how are you? And he said, my book's in proof. And there was this look of pure joy on your face, Steve. Tell us what's happening with your book before we do the papers.
Book writing is fun, but also exhausting. So I've spent the past couple of years writing a book on war crimes and justice. And when I started, I knew the themes were important. But as we all know, all of that thing like, can it ever happen? Will it ever happen? Who's stopping it happen? Who doesn't? So there's been lots of bits. So I've been traveling to Ukraine a lot, was in Israel and West Bank earlier this year. And constantly the story is changing and changing and changing. But now it's like a couple of days ago, I got those printed pages and it looks like a book. It's a nice moment. And amidst all the darkness, which we're seeing, which we'll talk about in a moment as well, it's incredibly professionally satisfying for me to feel, I think this is something which we all ought to be thinking about. So it's there.
And it comes out in February.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Let us dive into that deep, dark area that you've been covering. There's an article in Haaretz about America's warning about Gaza aid coming too late. This happened at the weekend, didn't it? America wrote a letter to Israel saying you have to let aid in, because 9 out of 10 shipments are being stopped or delayed in some way.
Exactly. So I guess we've got two parallel stories really here. One is America finally changing. So to be honest, the UN and others, and indeed the US government's own agencies, way earlier this year, were talking about starvation tactics and so on. And the US government, the White House, absolutely didn't want to go there. And it's interesting that for a bunch of reasons, partly because things have got so bad, but also, to be honest, US politics shifting in kind of quite odd ways, they have changed that a bit. So it's been interesting, two different sets of ways that's been reported. Most of the foreign reporting, including in the UK and in the US and elsewhere, has been, wow, America has really changed gear on this. I was interested by Dalia Scheindlin, the columnist with Haaretz, the brilliant Israel paper, which I've praised in this room before, because it's so interesting, I think, for us on the outside to see what's happening. And she was interesting, saying, great that this is happening, but she calls it a thimble of water for an inferno, and basically saying it's too late for too many. And she's critical of the fact that foreign countries, wrongly from her perspective, seem to feel that backing Israel is somehow, backing the Israeli government, backing Netanyahu is somehow good for Israel. And she's making the opposite argument, really, that you need to be much tougher against these crazy policies, which clearly are bad for Palestinians, massively, but really are not good for Israel either.
It's an interesting point that you and she makes there, that from the outside world, one often sees Israel as one and its government as one.
Exactly.
And yet this is, as we have covered extensively and have seen extensively, what Benjamin Netanyahu and his government is doing is very, very controversial and may not be what Israel needs in the long term. We're mentioning that very delicately. But
yes, I mean, it's so true. It's impossible to imagine, almost impossible to cover myself, but really impossible, that in 20 or 30 years' time, people will look back and think, thank God Netanyahu was standing up for this and that. Actually, the amount of damage that he is potentially doing, I say not just to others, but also to Israel itself, is I think, difficult to overstate. And I find that always... I, of course, am also speaking from the outside, so I find it really, really interesting to read the Haaretz writers, a liberal, a beleaguered voice, but an incredibly important voice within Israel.
Let's move on to an article in the Washington Times. Showcases the Harris-Fox debate, or discussion, or interview, I don't know how we describe it, showcases change in strategy for the Democrats. So for those of us who did not see the Harris-Fox interview, explain to us what what it was about, what was mentioned, and indeed what the Washington Post verdict is on it.
Washington Post, exactly, not Washington Times, Washington Post. The interview itself was described, which I didn't watch, I have to say, was in the middle of last European night. That was described as tough, lots of immigration stuff, the kind of things that you would expect. And it was a Fox News interview, and so it was pretty tough on her. And I think that most of the commentators seem to feel, it came out reasonably decently. Contentious interview is the standard headline there. I was really interested, as you say there, that change in strategy of do you engage with those people who are going to be really critical, or do you go they hate us anyway and let's not talk to them? And the Democrats have seen, what the Washington Post piece goes into, is that there's been a significant change in strategy on this, that really Clinton barely went there at all. We can all remember what proved to be a real political misstep, where she talked about the deplorables of Trump voters. And people don't want to be demonized in that way. And then Biden came a little bit closer in 2020, but now engaging. And I think most of the observers looking at that, including this piece, say, actually, you're quite right to be doing that, because you do need to bring those voters across somehow.
The interesting approach here seems to be changing, that when you have the discussion about the adage that Michelle Obama gave, when they go low, we go high, there was the hope that actually worked.
Yeah.
But what we have seen is that fear is an incredibly powerful energy.
Yeah.
And if Kamala Harris does engage with the likes of Fox, trying to engage with people, trying to raise fingers up, that might not have one iota of the power that being scared does.
That's exactly right, and a lot of very interesting stuff. There was one I actually thought of raising here. Another one was looking at Trump, the way that he has used fear, and the statistics which show how that has been really helpful. So you're absolutely right. It's an uphill battle, and we all know that it is absolutely on a knife edge what's going to happen in November, because so many people can be swayed so much into that fear which Trump is brilliant at stoking. So if you can engage them back, that's the big question mark, and they've decided at least to try.
Finally, a very brief moment to talk about female backflipping mountain bikers. Anyone who's seen mountain biking, I have no idea how they do it. That's all I'm going to say. But there's some stunning images in the New York Times article about women.
It is absolutely extraordinary. And as you say, I have that same sense. That was why this article leapt out at me. It was that watching that stuff, you think, how, why, like you can barely bear to watch. So the headline, female mountain bikers backflip their way to equality. So there's two stories here in a sense. One is there's a brilliant gender story, but for me actually, whichever gender is doing it, I mean, truly extraordinary. So it's a portrait of an event called the Red Bull Rampage in the middle of the Utah desert, described by the New York Times as the biggest and gnarliest mountain bike competition in the world. They have great New York Times phrases: dusty trails of blood, sweat and tears that tumble down the craggy, crumbling sandstone slopes. And it really is. You have to think, why would somebody do this? Of course, it is adrenaline. But as another description there is that they serve as their own crash test dummies for a few days. How fast do I need to hit that jump to cross and reach the landing? And I love this phrase, can I slow down enough to keep from flying off a cliff? Even just reading that, I find scary. So it's been men that were doing it, and women quite rightly said, we want to, in ordinary terms, quite rightly, although I have to say my personal take is why would anybody of any gender or none want to do this? My first thought was, this is the kind of thing you do when you're very young and you feel immortal. But actually it was interesting to see that some of the person who won was actually a 39-year-old woman. So you'd think, surely you don't need to take those risks. But that's what's happening, and it is an exciting read. And as you say, some brilliant images as well.
It's an absolutely beautiful article. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. Steve Crawshaw. The time here in London is 7:31. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A look now at what else we're following today. An emergency meeting of the UN Security Council has heard dire warnings about the humanitarian situation in northern Gaza, where Israel is mounting a fresh ground offensive against Hamas. Meanwhile, the authorities in Lebanon say 16 people have been killed by Israeli airstrikes on the southern city of Nabatea. The regional governor said a municipal building had been hit. In other news, polls suggest that Japan's ruling party may lose its majority in the lower house in this month's election. Reports in the Nikkei newspaper predict that the Liberal Democratic Party may now not reach the 233 seats it needs, having held power there since 2012. Seoul's former police chief has been found not guilty of negligence following the deaths of 159 people in a Halloween crush in 2022. The Seoul Western District Court acquitted Kim Kwang-ho, the highest-ranking police official indicted for the incident, in contrast to the 3-year jail term it handed to the former local police chief. And Sydney's beaches have been closed after hundreds of black balls suspected to be toxic debris washed up on the shorelines. The authorities have closed Bondi, Bronte and Tamarama beaches as a precaution. Police are being advised against swimming near to or touching any of the balls. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. 8:33 in Zurich, 7:33 here in London. Now, Sweden plans to ramp up its defence spending and boosting its ranks. Up to 2.4% of the country's GDP could be allocated to the military. According to Sweden's Defence Secretary, it's in response to Moscow's increased readiness to take risks with other countries. Well, I'm delighted to say Elizabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of Goodbye Globalisation, joins me once again. Very good morning to you, Elizabeth.
Good morning.
These details were outlined in a defence bill. Could you bring us out a few more details that were in this?
Yes, so the way Sweden works is that defense is planned several years in advance, or rather the defense budget is planned several years in advance. So what was presented yesterday was the defense plan for the next 5 years, so 2025 to 2030. And as you say, spending on defense will increase quite a bit. And I think what's most important to remember is that in Sweden, it's not just spending on military defense, it's spending on total defense, which includes civil defense. And every country should have a minister and a department in charge of civil defense. But Sweden does it, and that's where a lot of this attention will go, because we should remember that civil defense covers the areas that are the most vulnerable to Russian and other attacks. We have seen in just the past few weeks mysterious arson attempts, sabotage attempts, and just a few days ago the head of MI5 warned of sabotage attempts in the UK. So that's an area where you really need to focus on, and that's what Sweden is doing.
Your line, Elizabeth, I'm afraid, is playing tricks on us, but we will persist until and for as long as we can. But let's just talk about the politics between this. You said it was these are ideas, these are projects that are formulated quite a lot in advance. But are they right for now?
They are. So this 5-year plan is essentially the structure for the next 5 years. Then obviously the government, which at the moment is a centre-right government that was elected in 2022, and so will be in office for another 2 years, will decide on the details. But the good thing, I think, about the Swedish system is that defense planning, or rather defense budget planning, is a bipartisan or rather non-partisan matter, where the government builds on whatever the commission that is in charge of looking at what's needed comes up with. So that's and if you do it that way, you get consistency. You don't get massive shifts between governments. So we can be sure, or at least reasonably sure, that what this government is beginning to do now will be continued by the next government, regardless of what that government is. Then you can say, 2.5%, 2.4%. I think it will go up to 2.6%. That's not enough, but it's a significant increase. And again, what matters is that where the money is spent. And with this new plan, it will be spent also on civil defence, which is where the big gaps are at the moment.
How much has NATO membership affected the way that Sweden's strategy is formulated?
Yeah, this is a seminal moment for Sweden, submitting or presenting a defence plan as a member of NATO. Now, I think there has been a realization across Swedish society that NATO membership is not going to take care of every defence need. You have to do things yourself, and in fact, you will have to help your fellow NATO member states where they are. So it doesn't mean that you can do defence on the cheap, but it does mean that you have NATO member states that will back you up, and that allows you to not have to do everything in such depth yourself, but you still have to do everything. You can't say, well, we are not interested in infantry because that's resource consuming. We'll focus on medical care. That's not how it works.
Elizabeth Braw, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. It's 8:38 a.m. in Frankfurt, which is where we head now because the city's book fair is in full swing, and Monocle's Deputy Editor of Book Publishing, Amy van den Berg, is there for us, and I'm delighted to say she joins us from Frankfurt. A very good morning to you, Amy.
Hi, how are you?
Very well, thank you, and glad to hear from you. So just set the scene for us. I mean, what is it like being at the Frankfurt Book Fair this year?
Well, it's very exciting. There's a ton of people here this year. There are 4 massive halls. Each of them have multiple levels. And there's a pavilion in the center and tons of people getting down to work. There are tables and chairs everywhere with agents, publishers, writers, all meeting, discussing rights and, new book ideas. So it's a very exciting atmosphere. and definitely a really good turnout.
And what is the general feeling this year in terms of, we've had a few strange years when it comes to COVID, which does seem like a strange memory, but it did have a big effect on the way that people bought, sold and published, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. And you know what? I think that the main field this year is just positivity in the publishing industry. It's very buzzy. There are people, publishers, agents who are turning up that haven't in the past couple of years. I think there's more of a kind of excitement about new deals being made, new books coming out. And yeah, as you said, there was a few years post-COVID that wasn't the case. So yeah, it's very buzzy. Yeah, very, very, everyone's quite positive, actually.
Indeed. I mean, just tell us about what people are excited about and where the buzz is coming from.
Right. So there are, a lot of people are obviously still reading. And a lot of escapism, actually, escapism fiction is what I've been hearing is the most kind of popular type of book right now. I think maybe because of the state of the world. People are rediscovering old series. There are authors, who have written, fantasy or science fiction who are now getting like new book covers and new deals and things like that, new translations. And also, a little bit of everything, actually, romance, mystery. One person told me that the boundaries between these are getting a bit more porous. So there are just, different authors trying new things, which is pretty exciting. When
you mean getting a little bit more porous, how does that sort of manifest itself in print and ink?
Yeah. So, a romance, a true romance isn't necessarily the same thing anymore. That might be tied into a mystery or, a science fiction book. There's a lot of interest in kind of melding these together. And it's really interesting. Apparently, young people are actually reading a lot more than a lot of publishers had thought they would. And the books that they're choosing are not just one thing, and people are just more interested in diverse topics, which I think opens the industry up for a lot more creativity and then different types of books coming out.
The one thing that is taking a back seat, though, is literary fiction.
Yes, yeah. Someone said maybe it's had its day. I think there was a time when literary fiction was everywhere in bookshops. Now, there are just more people trying new things. And yeah, I don't know. There's just a lot of different types of books these days.
Indeed. And so we're now in 2024, at the back end of 2024, Frankfurt setting the tone for the future. Where are publishers, sellers and authors looking to in the next 12 to 24 months?
Right. So the guest of honor this year, every year there's a guest of honor. It's Italy. So there's a lot of spotlight on their market right now. And international markets are struggling. More and more people are reading English editions first because English language editions are coming out in international markets first. And so there's a push to actually get, local, regional language books out first, like editions out first, just to kind of protect those markets. And if that's the case, then, maybe there'll be a book that comes out that's in the local language first and that will sell at a higher price. But then that's kind of good because then the author gets a higher royalty. So a lot of publishers are kind of making these deals to make sure that these markets are protected. So, but yeah, there still are a lot of English language books coming out, but there is a lot of Asian books coming out, a lot of representation from Asian markets at the fair. And quite an actual general international representation this year.
And from what you've seen and what you've walked around looking at, where's that one thing that you're super excited about?
I actually think I'm quite excited about the Hong Kong market right now. There is a lot of interesting things coming out from there. And also mangas is really cool right now as well, still. And that, a lot of those areas were quite buzzy and a lot of presentations and conversations happening around those sections of the pavilion. So, and the fair. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting things coming out of the Asian market right now, actually. Yeah.
Amy, thank you so much for joining us on the line. That was Monocle's Amy van den Berg in Frankfurt. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Now, it's never an easy task to capture a nation or culture on page or screen, but that's precisely what Barbara Nadell, an award-winning author, has done in her series of crime fiction novels set in modern Istanbul called Çetin İkmen. Her books have been recently adapted for television as The Turkish Detective, which was broadcast by the BBC. And that series co-star is Yasmin K. Allen, who was born to English parents and raised between Turkey, England and Australia. On Monocle's Hassan Anderson caught up with Yasmin and Barbara at the Monocle Quality of Life conference in Istanbul, and he began by asking Barbara about where the idea to write crime novels set in Turkey came from.
Basically, very sort of prosaically, a member of my family married a Turkish person. And then we started coming here. And I don't think you choose these things to have a connection to a certain place. It kind of chooses you. And I very much had the sense, it became my happy place. And the job that I had before I was an author was in mental health services in the UK. And it was a tough job. I used to write things set here because there weren't many back in the 90s, So I used to do this thing with no idea about publication, just to relax, because it's my happy place. But it had to have a sort of edge, which is why it was crime fiction, because the sort of people I was working with at that time were mentally disordered offenders, and that it had to be crime or it wasn't going to happen.
Another thing you were saying to me outside was that it's nice to be at the conference because you're getting to talk in English about Turkey.
Yes.
So, could you elaborate on that for me a little bit?
So I have been working professionally as an actress since I was 18 years old. I've been doing that, so I've got 16 years or something now. And, I work in Turkey as a Turkish actress. That's how I discovered myself and my craft and my art and my communication with it, and how I perform. 2 performances that I've given in English have been, one was as a Russian soldier and the other one was a Turkish police officer as Ayşe Farsakoğlu in Turkish Detective. So to actually articulate my experience from my English perspective is not something that I get to do often. So it's been really sort of fun and exciting to be around people with similar sort of experiences and get to talk about that perspective. Because I used to have more of a surrounding of people who were of perhaps a European or English or Western heritage who had either emigrated here or were working here for a while. But actual immigrants, like, my mother and myself, not so many, actually. Not so many at all. So it's really nice to get an opportunity to talk from this perspective, yeah.
When you're approaching a completely different country that you're not from and you have to make that your setting, what are the challenges that you face as a novelist to make sure you do it service, make sure you achieve authenticity? Was that daunting?
It is daunting, but you were also with the acknowledgement that there are certain things that people go through that are universal. One of the reasons behind the books was that where I was working in the hospital services, people who work in that environment have a very bad reputation. It's like you're all vicious, but the majority are not. But the challenges are huge. And it's the same with policing, absolutely. I mean, when police used to come in to us, they'd bring somebody in to us. The sense of humour was identical. You laugh at...
Gallows humour, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely, because what you see on a daily basis, you don't actually get any help with it.
Are you all right is quite a loaded question.
Are you all right?
Well, no.
No, but it's more along the lines of, have you cleared up the mess?
Yeah, right.
And that's very public service thing, Sense of humour is black as night.
It sort of has to be as a survival mechanism.
You have to make a joke out of it, otherwise you'll lose your mind.
And Yasmin, encountering Barbara's work and her version of Turkey through her novels and then working on it as an actor, what were your impressions? Is it something you recognised or is it something you discovered more about Turkey through?
It's definitely a sort of merging of cultures in the project. All of the cast obviously are Turkish actors, and we brought our sense to it and our real life experiences to it, and it was like a co-creation in that sense. So we'd be on set, and because there's also another element, there's Ben Schiffer, our screenwriter, who obviously turned it into a script for us, a wonderfully talented, wonderful man. So it was kind of a co-creation in that sense, to find something that was obviously written from a slightly perhaps more Eurocentric perspective in terms of the screenplay, But in terms of performance, we tried to colour it with as much authenticity as we possibly could as well. It is definitely a project that bridges that gap. It made me really happy how it was received on BBC because 20% of it is in Turkish, like the scenes. We pushed for certain scenes to be shot in Turkish. We just felt like certain scenes just didn't make sense for it to be in English. Yes, it's for an English audience, but just because the main character was transferred from London, you just can't speak Turkish with every single character in this story, and we pushed for certain scenes, and thankfully, the production team, they agreed, so we tried to add as much of that as possible, and for it to be received so well, despite being 20 to 25% in a, in inverted commas, foreign language, for me, just was a real marker of change. People would sit on Sunday and Monday evenings with their family, relax and sit back and watch the Turkish Detective and read the subtitles and actually engage in something that was not of their culture and let that into their living rooms. In the UK, for me, I just thought this was quite an emotional experience for me because it was, really bridged that gap, I thought.
Yeah, and it was people who, they sent me emails and things, and they said things like, I hate subtitles.
Yeah, right.
But this was so well done.
And that's amazing.
And that is such a compliment, isn't it? Because I know people who go, oh, no, it's subtitles. I'm going out.
That's it. Yeah. And Sunday evening,
Yeah.
And that's wonderful.
And that was the actor Yasmin K. Allen and author Barbara Nadal there, talking to Monocle's Hassan Anderson about the hit show The Turkish Detective in Istanbul. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Let's talk retail now with Rebecca Tay, retail expert and brand consultant. A very good morning to you, Rebecca.
Good morning, Emma.
Thank you for your time. Let us begin with the world of luxury. Now, a couple of days ago, I was in Paris and I saw the queues snaking out of Louis Vuitton and would never get the impression that anything was bad at the retail luxury giant. That's not quite the case, is it?
No, indeed. I think this is kind of a big story at the moment. LVMH, which is the parent company, of course, for Louis Vuitton, they have just announced that their third quarter sales or their revenues have fallen 5%. So it's a long time since this has happened for them. It is indicative of the luxury sector as a whole. There are still a couple of luxury conglomerates that are still due to report their earnings. So Hermès, I think, will be a big one next week. Kering as well, although Kering has also seen decreases in the last few quarters. But yeah, 5%, it's still a huge company, 9.15 billion euros, but to fall for the first time in many years is quite big news.
And the all fingers are pointing towards a decline in consumer appetite in mainland China, is that correct?
Actually, in certain markets, it's actually up. So, for example, in the US, I think they're saying, sales are up 2%, but it is a huge decline in China. I think they're saying it's down to kind of COVID levels even, so down 20% in that market alone. So definitely this whole kind of economic slowdown in China definitely being the major reason. Explain
a little, though, whether this is perhaps a slight rebalancing of what's been happening in the last 2 years, because anybody who's been following the luxury market in China for the last 24 months will know that people were going bananas, that retail sales were going through the roof. Is this a natural balance, or is this something that luxury houses need to start to worry about?
I think it is a natural balance. I think you're right that people are sort of freaking out, I think, in a sense, because it is LVMH and they haven't seen a slowdown in a long time. But it is a natural sort of balancing. As you said, the Chinese consumer acts very quickly. So when they're hot on something, they buy a lot of it, they buy aggressively. And then when things are a little bit kind of calmer, they slow down. And I think a large part of it as well is that the forecasts for these companies depend quite a lot on China. So, for example, by comparison, Japan is actually up, but Japan is a much smaller portion of their market. So even though it's up 20%, it doesn't have that impact to kind of balance out that overall decrease of 5%.
Let's talk a little bit about fashion and the restructuring of big brands. Milan Fashion Week a few weeks ago saw the quiet departure of Alberto Ferretti. No one would have really noticed that departure unless they'd really paid attention. But it has now prompted a much more profound restructuring at the firm.
Yeah, it was a little bit disappointing, to be honest, because Alberto Ferretti, she started her own brand She started FA, which is the Italian luxury group, in 1988, so she's been there for a long time. Nobody really knew that she was stepping down, so the fact that she sort of announced this after her show kind of meant that there wasn't really the sort of fanfare, I suppose, that sometimes the fashion shows kind of have as a sort of last show or sort of that stepping down. But as a result, they are announcing that Lorenzo Serafini, who has actually been a designer at her brand for quite some time, is stepping into the overall kind of creative director role. So sort of folding one of the other brands, kind of consolidating things a little bit and sort of cleaning up, I think, cleaning things up at the Ferretti company overall.
What needs to be cleaned up?
Well, she had her own brand, and I think it's, in a way, the fact that she sort of stepped down so quietly speaks to the fact that it has sort of lost its impact. As one of the shows of Milan Fashion Week, it's not one of the big ones. Everyone is looking to Gucci and Prada and Fendi, and indeed at Fendi there's lots of other news, but I think at Ferretti they were sort of running a few different sub-brands that maybe they didn't need to have. So they had Philosophy, the Lorenzo Serafini, which was already the brand that Lorenzo was looking after. They also have FA, which is the whole group. And so I think they're sort of just thinking, let's consolidate things a little bit and maybe focus on what we have. So they also own Moschino, which is another brand that has a distinct point of view. So I think there's sort of this consolidating and streamlining of the different brands within the group.
There's something rather reassuring at the moment, given the absolutely wild musical chairs and revolving doors, or however you want to describe the exchange of creative directors at the high end of fashion at the moment, to have someone like Lorenzo Serafini, who, as you say, has been steeped in the brand for a decade and a half. Is there an element of reassurance to that at the moment?
I think so, and I think for some time he's been there, as you said, for a decade, and he sort of really embodies the brand. I think, Philosophy de Lorenzo Serafini versus Philosophy di Alberto Ferretti, which it was before he came in, were very similar. He sort of carried on her aesthetic. They're really well known for their gowns and their sort of beautiful evening wear. And it's sort of, it is sort of reassuring to have that continuation whilst there is so much turmoil elsewhere.
Well, let's touch on that turmoil. When we had Kim Jones exiting Fendi, everybody's now looking at the next person in charge there, and all names are looking at Pierpaolo Piccioli.
Yeah, I think some people are saying that it's basically signed and done. They haven't, with these things, it's never officially done until they've definitely sent out a press release. It's been officially announced. But Pierpaolo was ousted from Valentino, and he's sort of been kind of waiting in the sidelines, waiting for something else to come up. And I think Fendi would be the perfect opportunity for him. It's menswear, women's wear, handbags, everything that he's kind of done at Valentino, but with another legacy brand.
Rebecca Tay, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producers, Laura Kramer, Carlotta Ribello and Chris Chermak. Our researcher was Sana Jamani and our studio manager, Lily Austin. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday here in London. I'll be back behind the microphone here at Studio One. Hope you can join me for that if you can. And The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.